It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Victor Thorne laughed as he kicked a bucket of wet mortar over Maya Sterling Thorne's boots in front of the city's lead architects. The gray sludge splashed upward, staining her worn denim and seeping into the mesh of her work boots. Maya didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still amidst the skeletal steel beams of the Thorne Heritage Wing, the acrid, chalky scent of dry cement filling her lungs. "Watch where you're standing, Maya," Victor said, his voice carrying easily across the open construction floor. He adjusted his silk tie, the gold of his Rolex catching the harsh afternoon sun. "Though I suppose it's hard to see through all that failure." Beside him, Sebastian Thorne smirked, tapping a rolled-up blueprint against his palm. He looked every bit the heir apparent in his tailored navy suit, a sharp contrast to the dust-covered laborers who had paused their work to witness the patriarch's arrival. Behind them stood Commissioner Holloway and a cluster of junior architects, their expressions a mix of discomfort and morbid curiosity. "My apologies, Father," Maya said, her voice low and steady. She didn't wipe the mortar away. She simply met his gaze, her eyes tracking the slight tremor in his hand that he tried to hide by shoving it into his pocket. "Don't call me that here," Victor snapped, his face reddening. He turned to Commissioner Holloway with a dismissive wave toward Maya. "You'll have to excuse the help. My daughter has a habit of clinging to things she isn't good at. I keep her on the payroll as a form of family charity, a tax write-off for a sunk cost." The junior architects whispered among themselves. One of them, a woman Maya recognized from the city planning board, looked away in shame. Sebastian stepped forward then, unrolling the blueprints with a flourish. "As I was saying, Commissioner," Sebastian began, pointing to the structural load-bearing design for the north mezzanine. "I've redesigned the cantilevered support system to allow for the glass atrium. It was a complex calculation, but I felt the original plans were a bit amateur." Maya looked at the lines on the paper. They were hers. Every stress calculation, every innovative weight distribution curve. It was the work she had spent 6 months perfecting before Sebastian had borrowed her laptop under the guise of helping her find a job. He hadn't changed a single decimal point, yet he spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had never swung a hammer in his life. "Impressive work, Sebastian," Commissioner Holloway noted, leaning in. The Preservation Society was worried about the weight on the original foundation. "This seems to solve the issue of the shifting soil." "It's what I do," Sebastian bragged, casting a triumphant look at Maya. "Some of us were born to build empires. Others were born to mix the mud." Victor clapped his son on the shoulder, the pride in his eyes sharp and cutting. "That's my boy, a Thorne through and through. Not like some people who spend $250,000 on an Ivy League education just to end up wearing a high-vis vest and boots they can't even keep clean." Maya felt the cold weight of the mortar hardening against her skin. She reached into the pocket of her vest, her fingers brushing against the cool, hard edge of an encrypted tablet hidden beneath a rag. She knew something Sebastian didn't. She knew that the soil samples he'd ignored in his haste to claim her work showed a subterranean water vein that would liquefy under the very cantilever he was currently boasting about. She also knew that Thorne development was currently leveraged to the hilt, and that this specific project was the only thing keeping their creditors from the door. "Is something funny?" Victor demanded, noticing the ghost of a smile on Maya's lips. "Not at all," she replied, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I was just thinking about the foundation. It's a lot more fragile than it looks." Victor sneered, stepping closer until she could smell his expensive cologne, something woody and arrogant. "You don't know the first thing about foundations. You're a laborer, Maya. Stay in your lane and keep your mouth shut before I decide this charity project has reached its expiration date." He turned his back on her, leading the group toward the elevator bay. Clara Higgins, the family's longtime housekeeper who had been brought along to serve refreshments to the dignitaries, lingered for a second. She caught Maya's eye, a flash of pity and secret recognition passing between them. Clara knew Maya wasn't just mixing mud. She had seen the lights on in Maya's small apartment until 4 in the morning every night for a month. As the elevator doors hissed shut, the construction site returned to its rhythmic cacophony. Maya walked toward the edge of the mezzanine, looking out over the city skyline. She pulled the encrypted phone from her inner pocket. Her thumb hovered over a contact labeled *E, Vance *. She glanced down at her boots, the gray mortar now a dry, brittle crust. With a sharp kick against a steel beam, the dried mud shattered and fell away, revealing the reinforced steel toe beneath. "Elias," she said when the call connected. Her voice had shifted. The submissive daughter was gone. In her place was the forensic architect who had spent 3 years buying up the Thorne family's bad debt through a dozen shell companies. "I'm here, Maya," Elias Vance replied, his tone professional and sharp. The commissioner seemed impressed with the new designs. He was. Sebastian took the bait. He presented the faulty cantilever as his own innovation in front of 5 witnesses, including Holloway. And the debt acquisition. Maya watched Victor's black limousine pull away from the curb 40 stories below. "Finalize the purchase of the mezzanine bonds. I want the Thorne development portfolio fully consolidated by Friday." "That's a big move," Elias cautioned. "If you trigger the audit now, you'll be out in the open." Maya looked at the hairline fracture already forming in the concrete pillar beside her, a flaw she had documented and hidden. "The foundation is already cracked, Elias. I'm just the one who's going to let the world see it fall." She hung up and looked at the blueprints Sebastian had left behind on a makeshift table. She picked up a heavy carpenter's pencil and drew a single, dark X over the center of the Thorne family crest embossed at the bottom of the page. The countdown had begun. Victor Thorne thought he had discarded a daughter, but he had actually invited a demolition expert into the heart of his home. Maya checked her watch. 2 days until the preservation gala. 2 days until the Thorne name became synonymous with the dust she was currently standing in. She turned and headed for the stairs, the sound of her heavy boots echoing like a drumbeat through the hollow ribs of the building. She wasn't finished with the mud yet. She was just waiting for the right moment to bury them in it. The next morning, the air in the Thorne Manor dining room was thick with the scent of expensive dark roast and Sebastian's cloying, oversized ego. Maya Sterling Thorne stood in the doorway for a moment, her work boots feeling heavy and out of place against the polished Persian rug. At the head of the long mahogany table, Victor Thorne was leaning over a spread of architectural drawings, his eyes gleaming with a rare, predatory pride. "It's a masterpiece, Sebastian," Victor said, his voice resonant with the kind of paternal warmth he had never once directed toward his daughter. "The structural integration of the glass atrium is something the Preservation Society has been demanding for years. This secures the Thorne legacy for another century." Sebastian Thorne leaned back in his chair, swirling a crystal glass of chilled orange juice. He didn't even look up as she entered. "It took some late nights, Father. Most architects are too afraid to blend the Victorian bones with modern load-bearing tech, but I knew exactly where the stress points were." Maya felt a cold, sharp prickle of amusement behind her ribs. She recognized those stress points intimately, mostly because she was the one who had calculated them 3 weeks ago on a private server Sebastian thought he'd successfully hacked. He hadn't just stolen her blueprints. He had stolen the version she'd intentionally laced with a series of subtle, catastrophic mathematical oversights. "Good morning, Maya," Victor said, his tone flattening instantly as he noticed her. He didn't offer her a seat. "I hope you're prepared for the site inspection today. The commissioner is expecting the foundation to be cleared. Try not to let your extracurricular interests in the mud delay your brother's vision." "I'm exactly where I need to be, Father," she replied, her voice as smooth and neutral as polished stone. She walked toward the sideboard, the smell of the coffee turning bitter in her throat. Sebastian finally looked at her, a smirk playing on his lips. He adjusted his silk tie, the gold cufflinks catching the morning sun. "Don't be bitter, Maya. Not everyone is born with the vision to design. Some people are just built to haul the bricks. There's no shame in knowing your place." "I know my place very well," she said, pouring a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. She caught her reflection in the silver carafe. Her face was a mask of placid obedience. In fact, I was looking at those designs earlier. The way the north wing cantilever sits, it's very bold. Almost impossible, really. Sebastian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening on his glass. It's genius, not impossibility. Maybe if you spent less time with the laborers and more time studying the family business, you'd understand the math. Victor huffed, rolling up the blueprints with a sharp snap of the paper. Enough! Maya, go to the site. Sebastian and I have a lunch meeting with Commissioner Holloway to finalize the gala invitations. This project is the only thing that matters now. Maya nodded and turned to leave, but as she passed the kitchen corridor, a shadow moved. Clara Higgins was waiting near the service entrance, her hands trembling as she polished a silver tray. As Maya walked by, the older woman stepped forward, ostensibly to adjust a vase of lilies. "In the pantry," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the industrial refrigerator. "The shredder bin. He thought he got it all, but he missed the original vellum scraps." "Thank you, Clara," Maya murmured. 10 minutes later, Maya sat in the front seat of her mud-splattered truck, parked a block away from the estate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, cold weight of a USB drive and the jagged scraps of vellum Clara had rescued. On the scraps were her own hand-drawn notes, annotated in a shorthand only she used, notes that proved the genius blueprint Sebastian was currently flaunting were direct copies of her discarded drafts. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from Elias Vance. "The debt acquisition is complete. You now officially own the holding company that carries the Thorne Group's primary construction insurance. If that building fails inspection, you don't just own the debt, you own the dirt they're standing on." Maya looked at the blueprints again through the window of her mind. She knew something Sebastian didn't. The load-bearing calculations for the atrium were off by exactly 4%, a margin that looked perfect on paper but would cause the glass to shatter the moment the temperature in the ballroom hit 72 degrees. She checked the weather forecast for the night of the gala. 74 degrees and humid. "Haul the bricks, Sebastian." She whispered to the empty cabin, a slow, lethal smile finally breaking her mask. "I'm not hauling the bricks, I'm pulling the rug." She put the truck in gear. The countdown to the gala was no longer just a date on the calendar. It was a fuse, and she had just struck the match. 24 hours remained until the Thorne name was buried under the weight of its own arrogance. 2 days later, the glass and steel cathedral of the Vance and Associates law firm felt like a fortress. Maya Sterling Thorne stood in the center of the lobby, her work boots leaving faint, dusty ghosts on the polished white marble. She felt the weight of the silver flash drive in her pocket, a cold, hard lump against her thigh that contained enough digital TNT to level her father's empire. Elias Vance was waiting for her in a corner office that smelled of expensive cedar and ancient, leather-bound secrets. He didn't look up from his monitors as she entered, his fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard with the precision of a surgeon. The rhythmic click-clack was the only sound in the room until he finally pushed a heavy brass paperweight across a stack of documents. "It's all here," Elias said, his voice a low baritone that resonated with the authority of 20 years in corporate litigation. "I've spent 48 hours digging through the shell companies Victor used to finance the Thorne atrium. He didn't just cook the books, Maya. He burned the kitchen down to hide the smell." She moved to the window, looking out over the city skyline where the Thorne Tower sat like a jagged crown. "He thinks he's untouchable because he's too big to fail. He's forgotten that the bigger they are, the more gravity likes to play favorites." "The ghost ledger is the key," he continued, sliding a physical folder toward her. The paper felt thick and expensive, the texture of a death warrant. "It shows he diverted $30 million from the Thorne Foundation's charity wing to cover the structural adjustments Sebastian requested. If the public finds out he stole from orphans to pay for a vanity project that's architecturally unsound, he won't just lose his money, he'll lose his head." Maya touched the edge of the folder. She could feel the pulse of the revenge she had been cultivating for 5 years. "And the gala." "The guest list is locked. Commissioner Holloway is confirmed. The press will be there in force. Victor is planning to announce Sebastian as the sole heir to the Thorne legacy during the keynote. Elias finally looked at her, his eyes sharp. You're sure about the atrium? If that glass holds, we're just whistleblowers with a grudge. The physics don't lie, Elias. Arrogance ignores the margin of error, but the heat won't. When that room hits 72 degrees, the expansion joints will fail. It's a mathematical certainty. She left the office 10 minutes later, but the silence of the law firm was shattered the moment she stepped into the elevator. The doors were about to close when a manicured hand blocked them. Sebastian Thorne stepped inside, smelling of cloying cologne and unearned victory. He didn't recognize her at first, his eyes glued to his smartphone, but then he caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the small space. What are you doing here, Maya? Finally looking for a pro bono lawyer to handle your bankruptcy? Or are you just here to sweep the floors? She didn't flinch. She didn't even turn to face him. I'm just checking on my investments, Sebastian. Investments? He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his shadow looming over her. You don't have investments. You have a truck that's older than your career and a bank account that probably looks like a crime scene. Dad was right about you. You're a sunk cost, a glitch in the Thorne bloodline. The elevator hissed as it descended, the floor numbers ticking down like a countdown. You should enjoy the gala tomorrow, she said, her voice like a sheet of ice. Make sure you stand right in the center of the atrium during your big speech. The lighting is transformative there. Sebastian sneered, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. Oh, I'll be in the center. And you? You'll be lucky if security lets you watch from the service entrance. I've personally instructed the guards to keep vagrants away from the perimeter. That includes you. The doors slid open. He stepped out first, his stride full of the casual confidence of a man who thought he owned the world. He didn't see the way she watched him, her gaze tracing the path of a predator. That evening, the air turned heavy with a coming storm. Maya met Clara Higgins behind a darkened garden shed on the Thorne estate. The old housekeeper's hands were trembling as she handed over a small, velvet-lined box. He's been looking for this, Clara whispered, her eyes darting toward the main house where Victor Thorne was visible through the library window, nursing a glass of amber liquid. It's the master access key for the building's climate control. He kept it in the safe, but he's grown careless. He thinks he's already won. Thank you, Clara. This is the last piece. Just be careful, child, the woman said, her voice cracking. He's a dangerous man when he's cornered. He's not cornered yet, Maya replied, her fingers closing over the key. He still thinks he's the king of the mountain. That's the best time to let the mountain crumble. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number, but she knew the cadence of the threat. Don't bother showing up tomorrow, Maya. I've officially signed the disinheritance papers. You're nothing to this family. You're just dirt. She looked up at the house, at the silhouette of the man who had traded his daughter for a monument to his own ego. She didn't feel rage anymore. She felt the cold, clinical detachment of an architect watching a controlled demolition. She checked the weather forecast one last time. The humidity was climbing. The heat was holding steady. The stage was set for a performance the Thorne family would never forget. 24 hours, she whispered to the rising wind. 24 hours until the ghost in the ledger comes home to haunt you. She turned and walked into the shadows, the silver key and the flash drive clicking together in her pocket, the sound of a trap finally snapping shut. The afternoon sun baked the red clay of the Thorne Legacy Tower's construction site, the air thick with the suffocating scent of pulverized stone and diesel exhaust. Maya Sterling Thorne stood by the temporary site office, her boots coated in a fine layer of gray silt that seemed to mock the pristine white hard hat she wore. She could hear the rhythmic, bone-deep thrum of the piled driver in the distance, a mechanical heartbeat for a project that was already dead on its feet, though only she knew it. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the perimeter, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over Maya's shoulders. Sebastian Thorne stepped out first, his Italian loafers looking absurdly delicate against the rugged terrain. He adjusted his silk tie with a smirk that had been honed through years of unearned privilege. Look at this, he called out, his voice thin against the roar of machinery. "The architect of our fortune, playing in the dirt. Father was right. You really do have a flair for the lowly, Maya." Victor Thorne followed shortly after, his presence a heavy, cold weight that seemed to drop the temperature of the humid afternoon. He didn't look at the massive steel girders rising toward the sky or the dozens of men working under his name. He looked only at the legal envelope in his hand. He walked toward her with the casual, predatory grace of a man who had never lost a fight because he always rigged the deck. "I assumed you'd have cleared out your locker by now," Victor said, his voice a low rumble. He held out the envelope, the heavy bond paper crinkling sharply in the hot air. "I brought the physical copy of the disinheritance. I wanted to see the look on your face when you realize that nothing is exactly what you'll be taking from this site." Maya didn't reach for the envelope. She simply watched him, her eyes tracking the way he wiped a speck of dust from his tailored sleeve. "A foundation built on a lie eventually collapses under its own weight, Father. I'm just here to ensure the structural integrity is documented." Victor let out a sharp, jagged laugh. He turned to Sebastian, who was busy taking a selfie with the construction site as a backdrop. "Do you hear that? She's still talking about blueprints. She thinks the world is made of math and logic." He turned back to her, his eyes narrowing. "The world is made of power, Maya. Power and the names on the deeds. Yours has been erased." He dropped the envelope at her feet. It landed in the red mud, the white paper instantly stained. He then pulled out a checkbook, leaning against the hood of the sedan to scribble a figure that made Sebastian gasp when he caught a glimpse. "Here, Sebastian," Victor said, handing his son a check for $100,000. "A little incentive for the groundbreaking tomorrow. Since your sister is no longer on the payroll, consider this her redistributed, sunk cost." Sebastian grinned, the entitlement radiating off him like heat waves. "Thanks, Dad. I think I'll buy that watch I wanted, the one with the tourbillon." Maya felt the sharp, metallic tang of the silver key in her pocket, pressing against her thigh. She looked past them to see a silver SUV approaching. Elias Vance stepped out, looking every bit the high-powered corporate attorney. He didn't acknowledge Maya with anything more than a professional, distant nod, but the brief contact was enough. The alliances were locked. Elias walked toward Victor, holding a leather-bound folder. "Mr. Thorne, the investors have completed their final review of the debt-to-equity ratios for tomorrow's announcement. They're ready to proceed with the full acquisition of the surrounding parcels." Victor beamed, his chest swelling. "Excellent, Elias. You see, Maya. While you're worrying about the dirt, I'm horizontalizing the entire district. Tomorrow, the Thorne name becomes immortal." "Are you certain the ledger is balanced, Victor?" Maya asked, her voice dangerously calm. It was a final mercy, a tiny crack in the door she knew he was too arrogant to walk through. "Sometimes the most dangerous debts are the ones you've forgotten you owe." Victor didn't even pause. He climbed back into his sedan, the tinted glass rising like a guillotine blade. "Stick to the shovels, girl. Philosophy is for people with bank accounts." As the car sped away, Clara Higgins stepped out from the shade of the site office, her face pale. She had been standing just inside the door, a silent witness to the exchange. She looked at the mud-stained envelope at Maya's feet and then up at the towering skeleton of the building. "He really has no idea, does he?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Maya picked up the envelope, not to read it, but to ensure it didn't litter her sight. She looked at the silver key in her hand, then at the flash drive she'd tucked into her belt. The countdown had reached the final 24 hours. "He thinks he's building a monument," Maya said, watching the dust from Victor's car settle back onto the red clay. "He doesn't realize he's just spent $20 million building his own tomb. Tomorrow, we show him the real cost of the foundation." The evening of the gala arrived with a predatory chill that the building's industrial heaters couldn't quite mask. By 7 o'clock, the atrium of the Thorne Monument was a cathedral of glass and ego, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast jagged shadows against the raw concrete pillars Maya had inspected only 24 hours earlier. The scent of white lilies was suffocating, thick enough to hide the faint, metallic tang of curing cement and the lingering smell of the red clay outside. Victor Thorne stood at the center of the marble floor, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand, and the undivided attention of the city's elite in his pocket. He looked every bit the silver-haired sovereign, his tuxedo tailored so sharply it seemed capable of drawing blood. He was holding court near a scale model of the building, gesturing expansively as he spoke to a group of investors. "A legacy isn't built on hope," he declared, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man who had never been told no. "It's built on the courage to demand excellence. My son and I didn't just design a skyscraper, we designed the future of this skyline." Sebastian Thorne hovered at his father's shoulder, nodding with a smirk that made Maya's skin crawl. He looked like a pale imitation of the man beside him, his eyes darting around the room to ensure everyone was watching his ascent. He caught the eye of a prominent journalist and leaned in, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "The cantilevered south wing was my personal project, a bit of a structural gamble, but I've always had a flair for the impossible." Maya watched them from the shadows of a recessed archway near the catering entrance. She wasn't wearing the mud-caked work boots or the high-visibility vest tonight. She had traded the grime of the site for a floor-length gown of midnight navy silk, the color of a deep, unforgiving ocean. Her hair, usually tucked under a hard hat, was swept back in a severe, elegant knot. She looked like a stranger to the life she had led for the last 6 months, and that was exactly the point. The silver key was a cold weight against her thigh, tucked into a hidden pocket of her dress alongside the encrypted flash drive. She felt the smooth metal and thought of the structural reports she'd finalized in the dark of her apartment. She thought of the monument Victor was so proud of and the $20 million he had poured into a foundation that was legally, and soon physically, compromised. "You look like you're planning a funeral," a voice whispered beside her. Maya didn't turn. She knew the scent of expensive sandalwood and the calm, low timbre of the speaker. "I am, Elias. I'm just waiting for the guest of honor to realize he's the one in the casket." Elias Vance stepped into the light, looking every bit the high-powered corporate attorney. He adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze fixed on Victor across the room. "The board is all here. Commissioner Halloway is already asking questions about the preservation grants. The stage is set, Maya Sterling Thorne. Are you ready to stop being the ghost in the machine?" "I've been ready for 5 years," she replied, her voice as level as a horizon line. As they moved toward the center of the room, the quartet in the corner transitioned into a frantic, high-tension staccato. The music seemed to mirror the tightening of the air. Maya felt the eyes of the room shift. A few guests whispered, trying to place her face. She wasn't a socialite they recognized, yet she carried herself with a terrifying, quiet authority that demanded space. Victor noticed the ripple in the crowd first. He turned, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second when he saw Elias. But when his gaze landed on Maya, his expression curdled into something far more toxic. He handed his glass to a passing waiter and walked toward them, his stride aggressive. "Elias, I expected you," Victor said, ignoring Maya entirely as he reached them. "But I don't recall authorizing a +1 for the help's legal counsel." "Maya isn't here as my guest, Victor," Elias said, his tone professionally neutral. "She's here in her own right." Victor finally turned his eyes to his daughter. He looked her up and down, a cruel, dismissive laugh bubbling in his chest. "Silk doesn't change what's underneath, girl. You can wash the red clay off your hands, but you'll always have the stench of the trenches on you. You look like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet." "Is that what you think this is?" Maya asked. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply watched him, noting the way his pulse throbbed at the base of his neck. "I think you're a nuisance who doesn't know when to quit," Victor snapped, leaning in so only she could hear. "You've spent months playing in the dirt while Sebastian and I built a kingdom. You're a spectator in your own life, Maya. A sunk cost. Now, leave before I have security remind you where you actually belong." Sebastian joined them then, his face flushed with champagne and arrogance. "Still here? I thought Dad told you to clear out yesterday. Honestly, the audacity to show up here looking like this." He gestured vaguely at her gown. "It's embarrassing, for you mostly." "I'm not the one who should be embarrassed tonight, Sebastian," Maya said. She turned her gaze to the Commissioner Halloway, who was approaching them with a curious expression. The Commissioner is looking for the lead architect. He has some questions about the load-bearing specs for the South Wing, the ones you claimed were your personal project. Sebastian's smirk faltered, his eyes widening as he looked toward the approaching official. Well, the specs are in the office. I can explain the theory. Theory won't be enough tonight, Maya interrupted. 2 hours. That was all that remained of the Thorne Empire. She could see Clara Higgins near the buffet line, the older woman's eyes meeting hers for a brief, somber second. Clara gave a single, sharp nod. The final documents had been moved. The digital trail was live. Victor straightened his tie, his ego reasserting itself like a physical shield. Enough of this. The presentation is starting. I have a speech to give and a legacy to cement. Elias, keep your client under control, or I'll ensure neither of you ever works in the city again. He turned on his heel, gesturing for Sebastian to follow him toward the raised dais at the front of the atrium. The lights began to dim, and a hush fell over the 300 guests. The Thorne monument was about to be officially dedicated. Maya stood perfectly still as her father climbed the stairs to the podium. She felt the flash drive in her pocket, a silent weapon waiting for its moment. The countdown had hit 0. Watch closely, Elias, she whispered as Victor gripped the sides of the lectern and leaned into the microphone. He thinks he's about to take his bow. He has no idea the curtain is already falling. Victor's voice boomed through the atrium, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, until it vibrated in the very marrow of Maya's bones. He stood at the mahogany lectern like a king presiding over a coronation, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than a laborer's annual salary. Behind him, the massive high-definition screen remained dark, a silent monolith waiting to broadcast the glory of the Thorne family. This monument, Victor declared, his gaze sweeping over the 300 elite guests, is more than just steel and glass. It is the physical manifestation of a legacy. A legacy I have built with my bare hands, and one that my son, Sebastian, will carry into the next century. Beside the dais, Sebastian Thorne smirked, adjusting his silk tie with a flourish of unearned pride. He didn't notice the way Commissioner Halloway leaned back, his silver eyebrows knitting together in a mask of professional skepticism. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the faint, sterile ozone of the idling electronics. Maya felt the cold, hard edges of the remote trigger hidden in the palm of her hand. She stood near the shadows of the rear pillars, a ghost in the house she had technically designed. Her father hadn't even looked her way. To him, she was merely a shadow, a sunk cost to be ignored until she could be discarded. Sebastian's vision for this project, Victor continued, his voice dripping with practiced warmth, is what brings us here tonight, while others doubted he led. The first rage spike hit Maya like a physical blow. He was handing her life's work, the countless nights of structural calculations and architectural soul-searching, to the brother who couldn't even read a blueprint without getting a headache. She saw Elias Vance catch her eye from the front row. The attorney gave a microscopic nod. "I have something to add to that legacy," Maya said. Her voice wasn't loud, but she had timed it for the exact moment Victor paused for dramatic effect. It cut through the room like a piano wire. Victor's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing into predatory slits. "Not now, Maya. Security, please escort the help to the perimeter. This is a family moment." A ripple of uneasy murmurs moved through the crowd. Sebastian's smirk faltered. Maya didn't move. She stepped into the light, her boots clicking sharply against the polished marble, a sound of finality that silenced the whispers. "You're right, Victor," she said, using his first name with a coldness that made the socialites gasp. "It is a family moment. Let's look at the family records." She pressed the button. The screen behind Victor didn't show the gleaming architectural render of the monument. Instead, a series of scan documents flickered into existence, 30 feet high and impossible to ignore. They weren't blueprints. They were offshore bank ledgers, forensic audit trails, And most damningly, the forged signature of Maya's mother on the documents that had stripped Maya of her trust fund 10 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the atrium. Victor turned, his neck creaking as he faced the screen. His face didn't just change, it disintegrated in real time. The practiced, statesman-like bronze of his tan curdled into a sickly, translucent gray, making the broken capillaries on his cheeks stand out like jagged purple lightning. His eyes, usually sharp with arrogance, bulged and darted frantically, losing focus as the pupils dilated into pinpricks of pure terror. His lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that made his expensive porcelain veneers click together with a sickening sound of bone on bone. The veins in his neck corded, pulsing with a frantic, uneven rhythm that suggested a heart ready to burst against his ribs. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a cornered animal realizing the cage door had been welded shut. Commissioner Holloway stood up, his face a mask of thunderous fury. "Victor, what is the meaning of these offshore accounts? These are preservation funds." Sebastian was frozen, his hand still hovering over his tie, his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic O. Clara Higgins, watching from the kitchen entrance, clutched a silver tray to her chest, her eyes bright with the tears of a decade-long wait for justice. Victor tried to speak, but only a wet, wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked at the crowd, then at the screen, then finally at Maya. He reached out a hand, perhaps to beg or perhaps to strike, but Maya was already turning away. "You spent 30 years building a monument to your ego, Victor," Maya said, her voice steady and devoid of pity. "I spent 10 minutes turning it into your tomb. Elias has the originals. The commissioner has the authorities." She didn't wait for the shouting to start. She didn't wait for the security guards to realize their paychecks were about to bounce. Maya Sterling Thorne walked through the center of the atrium, the crowd parting like the Red Sea before her. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her, muffling the sound of her father's empire finally hitting the ground. The sirens were a low, rhythmic thrum against the cool night air, growing louder with every heartbeat. Maya Sterling Thorne stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, her breath hitching in the sudden silence of the street. Behind the towering glass doors of the Thorne Plaza, the muffled roar of a dying empire continued. But out here, the world felt strangely still. The scent of ozone and wet asphalt filled her lungs, a sharp, cleansing contrast to the suffocating perfume and expensive sweat she had left behind. Elias Vance stepped out a moment later, his tailored coat flapping in the breeze. He held a thick, leather-bound folder against his chest, the physical manifestation of 5 years of meticulous planning. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded toward the black sedan pulling to the curb. Commissioner Holloway stepped out of the vehicle, his face a mask of grim professional duty. He didn't look like the man who had shared a vintage cognac with Victor Thorne only 2 hours ago. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of a very deep, very dark well. "The evidence is being verified by the digital forensics team as we speak," the commissioner said, his voice clipped. "I've already seen enough to pull the heritage grants. The Thorne Group is officially under federal audit." Inside the atrium, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to a primal, desperate scramble. Maya watched through the glass as the man who had once been her world, the man who had dismissed her as a sunk cost, began to physically unravel. Victor Thorne was no longer the apex predator of the city's skyline. He was hunched, his fingers clawing at the edge of a mahogany table, as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling through the floor. The bronze tan that usually gave him an air of eternal vitality had faded into a sickly, translucent gray. His jowls trembled, and his eyes, once sharp and predatory, were wide and glazed with a frantic, uncomprehending horror. He looked like a statue caught in the middle of a slow-motion collapse, the cracks spreading across his face with every second of silence from the crowd. "It's a fabrication," Victor's voice cracked, the sound echoing off the marble walls. He reached out to grab the sleeve of a board member, but the man recoiled as if touched by something infectious. My daughter is unstable. She's a laborer, a girl who spends her days in the dirt. You're going to believe her over the man who built this city." Sebastian Thorne stood a few feet away, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at his father, then at the approaching officers, his mind clearly whirring with the cold mathematics of survival. The enabler was finally looking for an exit. "I didn't know, Dad," Sebastian blurted out, his voice high and thin, carrying across the room to the dozens of witnesses now filming the scene on their phones. "I told you we should check the audits. I tried to tell you the offshore shifts were a mistake." Victor froze, his head snapping toward his son. The betrayal in his eyes was visceral, a jagged wound opening in real time. You signed the memos, Sebastian. You took the bonuses." "Under duress," Sebastian shouted, backing away and raising his hands as if to ward off a ghost. "I was following orders. I'm a victim in this too. I'll cooperate. I have the passwords to the secondary servers." The face slap was no longer a single moment. It was a cascade of falling masks. Clara Higgins, the housekeeper who had spent 20 years observing the Thorne family from the shadows, stepped forward from the edge of the kitchen staff. She wasn't carrying a tray of champagne tonight. She was holding a small, silver digital recorder. "The orders weren't under duress, Sebastian," Clara said, her voice steady and quiet, yet it commanded the room. "I have the recordings of the Tuesday night meetings. You weren't afraid. You were hungry. And you were cruel." Maya stepped back through the doors. She didn't come in with the fire of a revolutionary. She came with the cold, measured pace of an architect surveying a site that had finally been leveled. She stopped 10 feet from Victor, watching as the weight of his own legacy finally crushed his spine. "The authorities have the forensic trail, Victor," she said, her voice devoid of the rage he expected. "The bank has frozen the Thorne Group's operational accounts. By tomorrow morning, the only thing you'll own is the suit you're wearing, and even that was bought with the inheritance you stole from my mother." Victor tried to muster his old fire, his mouth twisting into a sneer that failed to take hold. "You think this is a win? You've destroyed your own name, Maya. You're a Thorne. You'll go down with this ship." "I stopped being a Thorne the day you told me I was a liability," she replied, her gaze never wavering. "I'm a Sterling. My mother's name is on the deeds now. Yours has been erased." The authorities moved in. There were no handcuffs yet. Those would come at the precinct. But the physical proximity of the officers was the final blow. Victor looked around the room, searching for one friendly face, one ally, one person to tell him it was all a mistake. But the board members were already texting their lawyers, and the guests were moving toward the exits, their faces turned away in a collective, silent shunning. Sebastian was already being led toward a side exit for questioning, his protests fading into the high, vaulted ceilings. Victor was left alone in the center of his atrium, the lights reflecting off the massive screen that still displayed the black-and-white proof of his ruin. "Maya," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "Wait, we can fix this. Think of the legacy. Think of what we built." Maya didn't stop. She didn't even slow her pace as she turned back toward the night air. "The legacy is buried, Victor," she said over her shoulder. "I'm just the one who finally put the headstone in place." She stepped back out into the cool evening, the heavy glass doors hissing shut behind her, sealing the patriarch in his tomb of glass and steel. The blue and red lights danced across the face of the building, a frantic, colorful neon sign marking the end of an era. Maya looked up at the stars, feeling the heavy weight of the Sterling estate key in her pocket. The empire had fallen. But as she watched the first few drops of rain begin to wash the dust of the Thorne legacy from the pavement, she realized that clearing the ground was only the beginning. The real building was about to start. 6 months later, the air in the new Sterling Vance headquarters still smelled faintly of fresh white oak, and the crisp, ozone scent of a high-end filtration system. Maya Sterling Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the city wake up. She wasn't wearing the grease-stained coveralls of a site laborer anymore. Today, she wore a charcoal wool suit that fit her like armor, her hair pulled back into a sharp, uncompromising knot. She looked at her reflection in the glass, and for the first time in years, she didn't recognize the ghost staring back. She saw a woman who had cleared the rubble and finally begun to build. The heavy glass door hissed open, and Elias Vance stepped inside. He carried a single leather-bound folder, his expression one of professional satisfaction. He moved to the mahogany desk, his footsteps silent on the deep pile carpet. "It's done, Maya," he said, his voice low and steady. "The final liquidation of the Thorne holdings was finalized at midnight. The last of the debt has been settled, and the remaining assets have been absorbed into your private equity firm. The Thorne name is officially a matter of public record and private history." Maya didn't turn around immediately. She watched a hawk circle a skyscraper in the distance. "And Victor? He's settled into the apartment in Queens," Elias replied, checking a tablet. "It's a 2-bedroom, 4th floor, no elevator. I'm told he spent the morning arguing with the building manager about the quality of the water pressure. Old habits die hard, even when you're living on a fixed pension and Social Security." She felt a strange, hollow thrum in her chest. It wasn't pity that had burned away months ago, but a quiet, heavy realization of the finality of it all. Victor Thorne, the man who once moved markets with a whisper, was now a man complaining to a landlord who didn't know his name. "And Sebastian?" she asked. "Your brother is currently awaiting the start of his community service hours," Elias said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The fraud charges were downgraded in exchange for his testimony against the board members, but the judge was quite firm about the manual labor. "He's currently picking up litter along the interstate. I believe he finds the orange vest quite unflattering." Maya turned then, her fingers tracing the edge of a small, bronze model of a suspension bridge on her desk. It was a piece she had designed in secret years ago, one Victor had called a waste of company resources. Now, it sat in the center of her power. "I have to see him, Elias, one last time, to hand over the personal effects Clara Higgins saved from the estate." The meeting took place an hour later in a sterile, fluorescent-lit legal annex. When Victor entered the room, the change was visceral. He looked smaller, his skin sallow and hanging loose on a frame that had lost its intimidating bulk. His suit was one Maya recognized, a bespoke Italian cut, but it was frayed at the cuffs and hung off his shoulders like a shroud. He sat across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water. "You look well, Maya," he rasped, his voice lacking its former boom. "I suppose the view from the top is everything you hoped it would be." "It's quiet, Victor," she said, her voice like silk over stone. "That's the part they don't tell you about. It's very, very quiet." He let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "You think you've won, you think you've replaced me, but look at you. You're just like I was, cold, calculating, alone." "I'm not alone," she countered, sliding a small wooden box across the table. "I have the people who stayed because they chose to, not because they were afraid to leave. Clara is managing my household now. She's happy. She has a pension, something you never thought to give her in 30 years of service." Victor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of the old, entitled rage sparking in his gaze. "She was a servant, you were a daughter, and you threw it all away for what? A title, a building with your name on it. You destroyed a dynasty for a grudge." "I destroyed a prison," Maya corrected him. She stood up, the chair scraping softly against the linoleum. "Inside that box are the photos of Mom you tried to burn, and the deed to the small cottage in Maine she wanted to retire to. It's yours now. It's all you have left of the Thorne legacy." He looked at the box as if it were a coiled snake. His mouth opened, a dismissive insult forming on his lips, something about her lack of loyalty, her emotional weakness, but the words died in his throat. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that his power over her had not just ended, it had evaporated. He was a ghost, and she was the one who had finally stopped believing in him. Maya walked out of the room without looking back. She passed through the lobby, the sound of her heels clicking with a steady, rhythmic confidence. Outside, the city was loud, chaotic, and brimming with potential. She felt the weight of the last 6 months, the legal battles, the sleepless nights, the loss of the only family she had ever known, settle into a permanent, bittersweet ache. She had won. The empire was hers. But as she stepped into the back of her car, she looked at her hands. They were clean, free of the dust and grime of the construction sites, yet she could still feel the phantom weight of the bricks she had moved. She had spent so long tearing down her father's world that she hadn't realized how much of herself she had sacrificed to do it. Maya Sterling Thorne leaned her head back against the leather seat and closed her eyes. The revenge was complete. The karma had been delivered in full. Now, for the first time in her life, she had to figure out who she was when she wasn't fighting for survival. The sun hit the glass of the skyscrapers, turning the city into a forest of light, and Maya finally let out a long, slow breath. The ground was clear. The foundation was set. Now the real work could begin.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.